So my name's Matt Thomas. I've been a full stack web developer for over 15 years. My primary focus for that duration has been PHP, mostly MVC frameworks, Cake PHP, Yi, Zend, Laravel, that kind of thing. I also have done some Vue and some JavaScript frameworks as well, just as a little bit of a background. Uh, in my current position, Vagrant has been a big part of our development and deployment and strategy because we are using EC2s and VMs in Amazon, and then on our local hosts, we're using VirtualBox. So, and to Brian's point, uh, Docker and Vagrant are sort of kissing cousins. If you're going to go to the cloud with containers, you want to go with Docker. If you want to go to Steel or EC2 VMs, full OS deployment kind of environments, you want to go potentially Vagrant might be your answer. They give a lot of the similar features as far as defining your environment and command line interface for controlling your VMs and your environment. Okay, get my mouse up here so Vagrant allows you to repeatedly create the same environment from developer to developer, from environment to environment. A VM can contain numerous applications and is a full OS as opposed to Docker, which is typically a single process, which I'm getting ahead of myself here. It's created by HashiCorp, which has a huge ecosystem for this kind of thing, from single developer all the way up to enterprise class maintenance and management of these kind of environments. Vagrant supports your configuration management systems from shell scripting all the way up to Ansible, Salt, Puppet, all those. It can handle it all. So just a brief overview. So, and then here I've already covered some of this, but Docker it's meant to run like a single process or a small application, have numerous Docker containers to build out your entire application, one for each process in general. It shares the host OS and it isolates each process in between containers. It doesn't isolate the process from the host OS though. We discovered that last month during the Docker presentation. So one of the advantages is Docker images have layers, which reduces the storage required for duplicate containers. There is an equivalent situation depending on what VM provider you use. And here's where I state, if your life cycle, your application is in containers, stick with containers and use Docker. Okay? But some systems, even in enterprise now, even when you're migrating to containers, you still have stuff that's still either on Steel or in EC2s or whatever. Vagrant VMs are complete guest OSs. They have full isolation. The host OS has no access to the guest unless you set it up as like on a network. So it isolates your processes, your file systems, your network interfaces, everything. So Vagrant itself doesn't have the equivalent of Docker layers like to reduce space, but providers like VirtualBox can do link clones. And I'll show you, I can demonstrate a little bit of the link clones thing a little bit later. It's a little bit tricky because it creates extra VMs that you just leave there dormant, and that's what it's actually using as a file system. And again, if your application lifecycle ends on steel or is in virtual machines, then Vagrant could be your solution. Can Vagrant and Docker coexist? Sure. Docker's actually a provider for Vagrant. So you can literally have a Vagrant file that does nothing but stand up a Docker container. Quite interesting. I haven't quite discovered a good use case for that yet, but so installing Vagrant. So this is, you want to go to vagrantup.com and follow the getting started instructions. A lot of package managers, Ubuntu and Red Hat Stack have packages to install. Apparently, they're not good at keeping up with the latest version of Vagrant, and it causes issues. So Vagrant recommends that you go get the installs from their website and install it via that, as opposed to using npm or yum, or not npm, apt or yum or rpm. So providers. So Vagrant does nothing more than call API for a given provider. So it doesn't provide the VM mechanism itself. It's just a control mechanism for instantiating and configuring the VM. So it can use Vagrant or VirtualBox, again Docker, VMware, Hyper-V. All these providers are available. By default, it's going to use VirtualBox. That's what I've used, and I have not had any trouble. Really, I don't have huge applications that are going to need vast amounts of resources to cause issues. It is a well-documented fact that if you can fork over the dough for VMware, you get better performance and a little bit more features. But there isn't a free version of VMware that I'm aware of. So there's also service providers for things such as Rackspace, EWS, Google, Linode. They all have custom providers written for them typically by the provider themselves, that allow you to take a VM from your local machine and just change the provider to EC2, and off it goes, and it'll be running in your EC2. So it can literally go from developer to production with the same Vagrant file. And feel free to interrupt me, jump in with questions. I know this is not rocket science to this point, but feel free to.
I did have one question. So you're talking about the Vagrant installs and not using the package managers, but going to the Vagrant website. If we're both developers and we have different versions of Vagrant, does that cause issues? Or
not typically.
Okay.
I haven't run across any issues with different versions.
I'm sure after a while,
if you're close enough, I haven't ever had an issue where it was a problem. So
it usually seems to be more calculated integration. When I've had a Vagrant box that I've created and gone 6 months or more without, and I have to work with VirtualBox again.
Well, and also I've had more issues with like switching from Vagrant VirtualBox. Golly gee whiz. VirtualBox 3 to 4. I had more issues upgrading my provider than I did with Vagrant. So, but what Mark said, whereas, yeah, keep it on an even keel. So you have to install the provisioning system you want to use. I'm a big Linux command line fan, so I just literally wrote bash scripts to execute what I would type in the command line, and that's what you'll see tonight. At work in our enterprise, we use Ansible. I know at Mark's place they use Puppet, and I know somebody else is a fan of Salt. So, and those are all supported. So I think that's like the big 3 or 4, and of course Chef's up there. So they can really support anything you want to do as far as provisioning system. So, Initializing your first Vagrant box. So we're gonna create a folder where you want your Vagrant box to live. This is just literally a Vagrant file. A lot of times, if you have source code, you literally do it right in the root of your project, and then the Vagrant file just lives there. And some people like to separate out your Vagrant file, because especially if you've got supporting scripts and that kind of thing. So maybe you create a Vagrant folder and have everything in there. Either way, it works just fine. So Vagrant file is actually a Ruby script. Okay, so if you can think of something to do and write it in Ruby, your Vagrant file can do that. I actually have, so all the blue links in this presentation are all links to outside resources for the presentation. So when we give away, you can see the link up here. There's a short link on the front page we'll give you. But you can go and see all the examples of what I'm talking about. There's actually a pretty well used Vagrant file that does nothing but read JSON configuration. So they converted the configuration from Ruby to JSON, and you just build out your servers using JSON objects and then execute your Vagrant file. And so you don't even have to learn Ruby at that point. If you want to use Puppet for any reason by chance, if, like you guys are using, there's a project called Puffit that's written in PHP, and you can either go to the site itself or you can install it locally, and it literally it'll walk you through the process of creating a Vagrant file for you. Okay? So, and to demonstrate, I'll just jump over here. So what I have is I just have this is an empty directory. So all I have to do is Vagrant init. And so I'm going to shrink this up a little bit here. You'll see that it created a Vagrant file. Now I want to show you something. Right here, you'll see that it says Vagrant VM config VM box base. What you have to know is that the VM box base doesn't exist. This Vagrant file will not actually start anything. It will error out. Okay? But the advantage of doing an init like this is that this file is full of documentation of exactly how to create a Vagrant file for you initially. So you literally read through the documentation and you either augment what's there or uncomment it, whatever. It's all right here just by running Vagrant init. Okay? Questions about that? I'm going to go into much further detail in what exists in this file in a moment. So that's essentially what Vagrant init does. You can also, if you happen to know the box you want to initialize instead of base, you can provide the name of that box at the init, and it will replace that base with that box, and then you actually have something that it will boot. In this case, this would boot a basic 1604 Ubuntu box. Nothing special about it. It would just literally be an Ubuntu VM running on your machine. That it's just bare bones VM. Questions regarding init?
Does Vagrant enforce some kind of naming convention, or is it just?
It's a lot like Docker's container thing, and we'll show you that here in a second.
Namespace.
Yep. So here, I got ahead of myself again. So Vagrant will initially have lots of comments, and the most important thing is that VM box, which is your base image. Base doesn't exist. So what we can do is we can go out to Vagrant up searches, and as you can see here, Ubuntu comes up pretty high. Anybody ever heard of Laravel Homestead? literally is a Vagrant instance. If you've ever used Laravel Homestead, you've used Vagrant. Maybe not without even knowing it.
So, question: this
Sure.
would be the equivalent of going to like Docker search.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the okay. We get
Yep.
different images.
Yeah. There's no official. I don't think so. On Docker, there's like an official designation.
Yeah.
But I doubt people are getting the namespace Ubuntu or Laravel just willy nilly. So.
You look at the download count too.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at this, Ubuntu's, I mean, they're releasing literally quite regularly. I've literally have to update my Ubuntu box if I want to keep it up with this quite often. So they definitely they are maintained. So, and of course, Laravel's 24 days old. The HashiCorp stuff, this would be what they consider to be their official stuff, what they support. And as you can see, all kinds of stuff here. And you can search by provider, so like if you're looking for a specific provider, you can narrow it down.
This is all free, right?
Yep. Sure is.
But there's no window box, is there?
Actually, there is, but they're not licensed.
NW Rock.
So, yes, sir.
They go so like I know with Docker you can do if you want to search for like okay I want to spin up a RabbitMQ machine you could actually like do a search and like that like do a search and find RabbitMQ or find
There's LAMP.
one that's already set up.
Yeah. Yep. And that's what I'd recommend is if you, so like at our office, the DevOps guy went through and set up his own. So he has it exactly like he wants. But for personal projects, I come out here and find something that's got, gets me 80% of the way there at least,
So these are specifically starting points. They have all the general tooling in place that you would probably want to start a project from, and then add customization on top of it using one of the tools.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that makes sense. Just to specify the difference between boxes here, which is what you start from, the VMs and the end, which is what your provisioning adds in on top.
Well, I mean, you can think of it kind of like a class. You're going to define your class, which is what this is, and then you're going to instantiate it when you bring it up. So,
Well, or even like extended. Like if you look at the Homestead one, it's ultimately just built on top of Ubuntu. Right?
Yeah.
So your Ubuntu one that was listed first, like Laravel is just built out and extended on top of that. It's got the Laravel command line tools and stuff like that.
yeah, but unlike Docker layers where it would literally pull down the Ubuntu one and then add on whatever Laravel would, the read-only layers that Docker does. Once he does it for Laravel, it's its own package.
So
So
since you don't really have the same. So like if you have Ubuntu on top of let's say this, then maybe on top of Nginx, you don't like you can't really layer it the same way you're saying.
no,
Okay.
you can't.
You just you count one layer, and that's pretty
Yeah.
much it.
You get one foundation block and that's it. You don't really get to stack them.
They're full virtual machines. Right?
Yes.
One of the interesting things, specifically with Laravel and the way that, or the fact that they maintain their own box, is that that box, that virtual machine, stays in step with the framework that's in the back. So whenever a release to Homestead is made, it definitely works with all the tooling for the Laravel framework that they're pulling down, working with and stuff like that. So I don't think that's really the ultimate intention of Vagrant, but it's kind of a nice side effect the way they're using Homestead in tandem with development.
Well, and like Docker container library or whatever it is, there's you can tag. They have tags in here, so if you wanted to get a particular version, so let's say they're on 4, but you're running 3 whatever, then you can go ahead and just configure your box. So this VM config VM box will always just get the latest by default. Then if you want to go back a version, then you provide the version and then whatever string they provide. And now you're forcing it into what Chris said is they keep up. So like if you want to run the latest version of Laravel, you just get the latest version and it will be consistent and you will have a definite running environment because that's what they're maintaining it to be that way.
Right. It's kind of like with Docker, you got color latest, I guess, is there.
Yeah.
The most recent thing.
Did you simulate, you're saying about Docker layers with provisioning your virtual box using like Puppet or Chef or something like that? So you just pull down a box whenever you need to, and then like, I guess like npm scripts or something, you can just run something that updates it, and I can just automate that process. Does that make sense?
I lost you.
So as you pointed out, or you pointed out about layers and how you can have like pull different things into your Docker container, right? With VirtualBox, could you do the same thing with the different technology, basically by saying you can create certain scripts that once you pull down the box, you can provision to other things.
That's what the provisioning system is I'm getting to. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, you're fine. That's good. That's good. So essentially you would bring down whatever so like if you want Homestead, but you decide you don't want to use Redis, you want to use something else, then you would have to use the provisioning side of Vagrant to potentially remove Redis and add whatever other software you want to use. So what it does is at that point and I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit again, but it instantiates the virtual machine and then it SSHs into your VM that it just created and then runs the series of commands, whether it be Ansible or shell scripts or Puppet or Salt.
You're talking about whatever you create to add the extra features.
Sure.
That you want.
Yeah.
So after the install, I said, okay, let me run this set of commands.
Yeah.
You know, that's the completion of your provision.
Right. And as a general metaphor, Vagrant's going to stand up the VM, which would be your cake, and then your provisioning is going to throw the icing and the special toppings on top of your cake or your VM. So
I see. So you kind of get the same effect as you do with layering, and you just do it a different way.
right.
Like
Exactly.
a Docker file, you start with that base image, the file,
Yep.
Or
But
like
it's-
Docker Compose. If you
That's
know,
exactly
Compose,
what it
right?
is.
There you go. Yeah, Compose also.
Yep. Pretty much that's it for that slide. So what you want to do first off is after you do your init, you want to, so you found your box, then you want to go in and put that string in your VM box, and you're ready at that point. So what we can do is I can go in and edit my Vagrant file. Why am I retyping it?
So they give you base, so yeah, base doesn't exist at all, and you're gonna just plug in into.
I think if you provide a box on your initial init, it'll come top of the box.
It will, yeah.
But if you just want to get the documentation.
So like this is pretty much the one I always use. So when I do an init, I just throw this in the command line and it's done. But if you don't know what you're going to do, then,
Download the box.
huh?
Download the box.
I have already downloaded this box because it's one I've used. So you update that and then, well, so let me demonstrate this. So literally all I do is this Vagrant up, and it's going to import the base box of that, and then literally what it's doing in the background is standing up the Vagrant, or the that box inside of VirtualBox. And here you can see it's asking to SSH into the VM. So it's waiting for the virtual machine to come up to the point to where it can SSH in. And it's already established port 22 on the guest to port 2201 on the host so that it can then SSH into the box. It's defining network routes right there. And it creates SSH keys and all kinds of other stuff on the Vagrant box so that your SSH functionality can work seamlessly. And we'll demonstrate that here shortly as well. But if you go over here to VirtualBox, you can now see that I have an init default and then a timestamp. So this is my VM running right here. And you'll notice that there's no presence of it. I started VirtualBox. There's no presence of this. It starts each VM headless. So unless you can declare it to start non-headless for your Windows boxes and whatnot, or if you got a development box or whatever, so that you actually have an IDE on or code or something. So there are additional configurations for software provisioning networks, sync folders, and then provider-specific configurations. So we're going to walk through that a little bit. So inside your, and I have full examples of these coming up here soon of 2 different scenarios, so you'll get to see it all work together. But these are working chunks. So here's where I provision. So here I'm writing an inline shell script. So I just tell it I'm going to use shell script to provision, and this is a Ruby syntax. And then it's going to be an inline shell script. Then this is the equivalent of Ruby here docs, if you're familiar. So it's going to go from this shell to this shell, and it's going to type whatever, it's going to SSH whatever is in between these 2 blocks over to your VM. So it's going to do an update to bring this OS up to date. It's going to install Apache. It's going to remove the HTML directory, and it's going to soft link the HTML directory to Vagrant, which so whenever, by default, Vagrant brings up your VM, and /Vagrant will be the root directory of where you instantiated your Vagrant file. Does that make sense? So if I have code right next to my Vagrant file, when I go into my VM, I should be able to go to /Vagrant and see those exact files existing on the guest. So it does a network share sort of situation there.
Like volume.
Yep, exactly. And then here's the same. So if you were to put a shell script in the scripts folder next to your Vagrant file, and then it does the exact same thing. All it has in it's apt-get update in here. It does the exact same thing. So your shell scripts can be infinitely complex and not necessarily mess up your Vagrant file. Questions regarding that?
So just the location of that would be vagrant/script/update.
So let's say your Vagrant file's here. So this is relative to your Vagrant file.
I'll just word it. Okay, I got you.
So if it's network sharing your source from your local machine into the Vagrant instance, are you ever putting any source in Vagrant, or are you just using it for its OS capabilities and everything else you do?
I always keep my source code on my local machine because, especially in a development environment, so that I can update it and do all that stuff without really dirtying up my VM.
Yeah.
So I just use the VM mostly for consistent environment across machine to machine to machine.
So you can, but thing is, you would probably most of the time destroy the box. So if
Right.
you persistent file there, you'll lose whatever you need. So yeah, it's a it's an interesting question and an interesting idea. In the sense that you want to be able to use this automation to say, all right, I did some configurations in here and I do something up, destroy the machine, bring it back up, and source code's fine. Part of that is also part of it's your source code, but also part of it is the databases that you're running. I've seen it where some people will actually put the data in the databases on the virtual machine. Like maybe they're using it to run a version of a database that they don't have in the machine. That's fine, but if you destroy your box and you don't back up your data, you just destroy the database as well. So depending on the project that I'm working on, I'll have the virtual machine really just run as the server to run all the software and stuff. But my code base will be mirrored up through the mapping here, and then the database will be coming back to my local machine, so that I can destroy the VM, and then everything that I need to keep is still on my machine. And like you run into issues there with, okay, well now you have to have that version of the database on your local machine, but it's a setup decision that you need or can and should make.
And how we handle that is we actually run SQL Server on the VM, but there's a file structure that MySQL or Maria uses to store the data in, and that path is mapped back to the local machine so that when you bring them up and down, it knows where to find the data, and it just handles it. Slightly, well, and it can be brittle because if MySQL doesn't find the path on the local machine, it starts, getting a little finicky. But that's how we do it at where I'm at now. So, yes, but to persist your data, we recommend that you don't put them in your VM because you want your VMs, like Docker containers, to be able to be volatile.
It also means that you can use tooling like tooling on your local machine that doesn't necessarily need to be on the virtual machine. So like your version of it, your version of if you're using a framework like CLI, or a CLI tool, you can use that on your local machine, not having to actually SSH into your virtual machine. All those changes are going to be reflected.
Network configuration. So, giving your VMs unique host names, you would do this inside your Vagrant file. You'll see in one of my examples, I actually stand up two machines. One's a web server, one's a database server. They come up and they talk to each other straight out the box. It's a complete dual system environment ready for web development. All that stuff is done right here, and you can get it. So your port forwarding, so this would be an example of an Apache configuration. It's going to serve up on port 80 on your VM, and on the host, if I wanted to access that, I would use 8787 or whatever port you want. I know some use 4200 or 8080 or 8000. There's all kinds of whatever you want. I suspect that I had more than one VM running at a time, and 8787 is where I landed on this one. So you're allowed to have as many network entries in your Vagrant file as you want. So if you need to share out, well, SSH is always shared out by default, so you just need to figure out what port that's on. And then, so like let's say you had MySQL or Redis, and you need to connect to clients there, you're going to want to share those ports out as well so that you can access those from your local client instead of having to always go into the VM to grab those. And this literally takes care of your network port sharing and everything. Every time it stands up, it'll do this for you. So, sync folders. So we were talking about these already. So you define your sync folders. So this is relative to your Vagrant file location. So when I say /source, so my Vagrant file is here, my source directory is right next to it. So these are relative paths unless you do that leading slash, and then you can get away with it sometimes to go to a absolute path. And then the other side is where that will be on the VM. So if I wanted to share out my source and put it in the var www HTML, I would just change the right side to that path, and it would automatically be available. And here is where I state the /vagrant file is always shared on the guest with the directory that the vagrant file exists in. So there's this little caveat with VirtualBox where if you don't turn off send file in Apache, it starts acting very, very flaky for your Apache box. So when you, or even Nginx has the same issue. So you have to turn off enable send file and send file, depending on whether or not you're using Apache or Nginx, for Apache or Nginx to serve up your files correctly. It starts getting into that, you know how Apache you can do browse folder, which you should never really do. It starts getting a little flaky. There's sort of some kind of conflict in there with that. So browser-specific configurations. Here you can see you can set up conditionals in your Vagrant file. So this one's specific to VirtualBox. It will. So this name right here will be what it's named inside of VirtualBox here. So it wouldn't have named this a net default timestamp. It would have gave it the name that is inside this code block. It would have just named it test vagrant. So instead of generating a random name, it's going to generate you're going to set it to a very specific name. And then this linked clone is, it's the same thing as layers. VirtualBox has the ability to do it. And what it does is so if you were going to stand up 3 of the same box, identical box, it would take that box, create a virtual machine that is not running. It's literally just used for the file system portion of the virtual machine. And then it'll set up another one that's linked to that file system and start it. And then any changes to the linked system get added to the one that's running, and the base linked box stays static. Questions about that? VMs are always slower.
Do you have to, is it like still in reserve full memory or anything like that?
So when you're using, are you talking about specifically when you're using linked clones?
Yes.
Or in general? So linked clones are going to use all the necessary resources for the running VM that it needs, except for the file system that's initially set up in the base link it won't be needed. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So like for example,
It does layer it to a certain extent.
So like if you're devoting RAM resources to that, you might have to give RAM to each clone, right?
Running clone.
Each running clone. Okay.
So how it works is so if you're going to run 3, you'll have 3 or 4 VMs in your VirtualBox instance. You'll have one that's nothing but the base image. It never runs. And then you have the 3 children that are the linked clones. So you get to save a little bit you get to save disk space on that, but you don't get to save any other resources. But when you're running,
I mean, disk space is big.
disk space it's cheap now, but it's still not infinite. So yeah, don't delete your base linked VM. That could be bad. So managing your Vagrant Vagrant boxes. So as long as you're in the directory that has the Vagrant file in it, it's going to read that Vagrant file and manage those instances. Okay? So to bring up, I demonstrated it earlier. To bring up your Vagrant image or your Vagrant VM, you just do Vagrant up. So Vagrant commands and Docker commands are very similar. So if you're familiar with Docker, you're going to be comfortable with Vagrant. To stop it, you just do halt, and then it'll just bring it down. And sometimes it's kind of neat to watch what it's doing over here because it'll start blinking sometimes. So now it's powered off, and it blinked up there.
In the scenario where you're doing multiple boxes, like let's say you're doing multi-tier web app where you've got your web server and your database on different machines, they have anything similar to what you might do with like Docker Compose, where you're bringing up like you have to go in and have separate projects for those?
Nope. I'll show you a multi-tier box.
Okay.
Yep. Multi-box environment. So, good question though. Vagrant status will tell you the condition of your boxes. So I've noticed sometimes when I shut down my box for the weekend from Friday to Monday and I don't happen to touch it, VirtualBox will eventually just like abort or pause my VMs, and it doesn't bring them back to life when I open up my box. So sometimes I need to go in and determine what status my VMs are in. You can either do that through VirtualBox just to check the status, or you can use Vagrant. I recommend using Vagrant because things like network provisioning, the port sharing, and all that stuff that's done inside of Vagrant, if you start managing your Vagrant box inside of VirtualBox, all that stuff gets omitted, and then you find yourself in some pretty janky places. It's not working the way it's supposed to, or you're expecting it to. Vagrant SSH will allow you to SSH straight into your box. It'll just put you right on the command line of your box within the Vagrant user, which most of the time I believe has. No, it doesn't. It doesn't have sudo privileges, but it has sudo privileges, but it doesn't bring you in elevated. There's also, if it's a Windows box, you can do Vagrant RDP. Provision. So let's say I am messing with my Vagrant file and tweaking it, trying to get it right. Instead of destroying your Vagrant box all the time and then upping it again and recreating it all the time, Vagrant provision will compare your current VM state to your Vagrant file and then bring it back up to speed or up to snuff. Vagrant destroy does exactly what it means. And then Vagrant validate will validate your Vagrant file. So if you're editing your Vagrant file and you start getting errors or whatever that you can't quite find, validate will do a lint on it and essentially tell you where you're going wrong. Questions regarding those?
So those boxes, they come up with access to everything.
Yeah.
And so the SSH private to your local machine, or is it just like that default SSH with
Well,
password is like just sitting out there? No, I don't think it's connected to the internet. It's just to your local host. So when you SSH, like you can't reach out to the internet. So
it can go out, but nothing can come in any more than you configure it. I'm sorry.
No, I thought it the other way around. That it was completely cut off firewall.
Okay, I think we're saying the same thing, we're just confused. So if I'm on the Vagrant box, I can get to the internet all I want. But the internet can't get to the Vagrant box any more than you configure it to. So if I open up port 80 on the box and make Apache run on port 80 and I expose it and I've got all the network configuration, well then it's exposed to the internet. I set up my DNS and all that stuff. It's literally like setting up a server. If you just bring up your server at your house, yeah, it's on the network, but you can't access it from anywhere. It's literally, Yeah. Yep. So, and again, that's the provider. So it's Vagrant or VirtualBox or VMware. That's that functionality. You're just using Vagrant to configure that functionality consistently across VMs, making it reusable. So to manage the boxes, so Vagrant Box allows you to add boxes, list them. And so we talked about searching for a box on the repository. Vagrant Box is managing the cache that is on your machine. So there's like a global cache so that every time you want to use that Ubuntu box that you always use, it doesn't have to go to the internet to grab it. So Vagrant Box allows you to manage that. And if I do, you can see I have several, even I have different versions of the same Ubuntu box on here because I've updated over time. Questions regarding that? Okay. So you could do list, outdated. So outdated would check the ones that need to be removed. So I had 3 of them on there. It'd probably remove the 2. Prune is the one you want to run from time to time when you have old stuff. It's going to remove those old images that don't have that aren't in use.
That aren't in use, like not running currently,
Well, I may be mistaken about that because I think I'm thinking of Docker.
So if you're pruning, are you at risk of pruning away data?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
Where he's got multiple versions.
See, I've got
Xenial there.
Yeah.
I think it's probably easier to be older.
Too. But if you had data like on, maybe I'm thinking about this wrong, but if you had data actually stored on the 2 that are getting burned, should we lose that?
no. These are the template
Just
boxes
okay,
as opposed to the actual instantiated VMs. Where is? Maybe they did away with that. Oh, it was. Yep, you're right. Thank you. So see, it removed the other 2 virtual boxes, which that saved me about 60 meg each. I mean, that's the deal is the Vagrant the VM based boxes aren't small. So, and then you've got update. So you can see here that I have one from 17. So if I were to run Vagrant update and then tell it Ubuntu Xenial 64, it's going to go out and grab the latest one and pull it down so that then the next time I instantiate that, I'll get the latest version of that box instead of the one I'm using. That could be good or bad. So then you need to start using your versions in your Vagrant file to make sure you're staying consistent. So that's that. So here's a simple Vagrant file. Go ahead. I believe it'll update all of them if you don't pass in one, but I don't want to try it here because.
If you go to family and then to Vagrant Box, it should tell you, it should give you the syntax. They'll probably have an optional box name there.
There you go.
So Vagrant Box options, yes, one of the options is box. So yeah, what I would imagine is that doing an update that's just Vagrant Box and everything.
It's going to try to update the entire system. Do that when you're on wired connection. And not in a conference center. or whatever this place is. So here's a simple Vagrant instance. It uses the Xenial 64. Like I said, I'm just a big fan of Ubuntu. So it sets up, again, the port forwarding. It sets the host name so that, now the host name here does not mean it will, the VirtualBox VM name will not be that. It's literally setting the host name inside the OS to that. So just be clear that the differentiation of that. And then it does a simple inline script where it does, again, it updates the OS, it installs Apache, and then down here we do a restart of Apache so that all the changes that came up took effect. So to demonstrate that, let's see if it'll, I just thought about it, but if it tries to do a update. So in here I have my Vagrant file, which is essentially what I showed you. Okay, and then I have an index.html that this gets mapped to the www.html folder. So when Apache starts, it should publish this index file from my local machine that says hello from Vagrant. Okay, so we bring it up. And it's saying I need to update my box because it's old. So it's going out and checking to make sure that there's no updates to the box that I'm using. And if it is, it'll notify me. Oh, so, and that's, so I outspoke myself. Because this box has been brought up already, it won't run that apt-get shell command and all that. It only does that when you instantiate it the first time. To get it to run again, I would have to do the provision. Okay, so it should be up and running, and just for grins, and I'm not going to do this. I'm going to do what I'm going to practice what I preach. I'm going to do a Vagrant status. And it tells me it's running. And it's named default. Okay? Inside of Vagrant. If I come over to, here's my simple that's up and running. Okay, what you'll see is that, and this is something else I wanted to bring up. I'm inside the simple directory here. That'll be the first thing it names it inside of VirtualBox. That's just how that provider works. Is it'll start with the directory name, then it'll use the VM, the VirtualBox, the Vagrant name, which we saw was default, and then it uses a timestamp. So that's how that will be named. And then if I go to localhost 8787, now I get that file, which demonstrates what we were talking about earlier, having the source on your local machine, but it's being served through the Vagrant instance. Yeah.
How many of these, I guess, if you had running on this random server production? I mean, like, you know, like how many? What's the maximum VM you can recall you've had running? Like any? I know it's just kind of like a weird question, but I'm just curious from how much. Let's say a server can handle. Like what would you say is a good number that you've had running on of different VMs on one particular box?
And unlike containers, literally this box took up 16 mega RAM. Or I don't see this. I don't see where it is. If I go in here, a gig. Yeah, right here. So it's a gig. So this box literally consumed a gig of my RAM. And it took up whatever disk space is default for, if I go into VM. So really, this is not what you really want to be doing as far as that goes. This is a standard 10 gig VM. So that comes from the base image. So that's part of the specs of the base image you want to evaluate. This might be a reason why you want to create your own base image. Is 10 gig may not be big enough. And you can go through and set the amount of memory that it needs to in your Vagrant file using the VirtualBox provider specific configuration. You can tell it what hardware configuration you want the VirtualBox VM to be stood up as. But to answer your question, you got 16 gig of memory that's dedicated to VMs. You can run 16 of these, ideally. I mean, you could always oversell. You could stand up 20 of them and see how things go. I mean, you could pull an Amazon or a Google and oversell.
And I think it actually tries to reserve the memory. The RAM needs the RAM. So if you oversell, the first one goes over.
Yeah. As you can see, I got my fair share of VMs on here. At any given time, I probably have 3 or 4 running at the same time at true true development environments. And I've not really seen, actually, my production environment is running right now. So there's 3 running as we speak that, and we're not noticing anything significant as far as latency or anything like that on the machine. So. So I know with Linode, which is what I happen to have, is they have a specific image that they want you to use. And then based on, so they have an image they want you to use, and then you pick your OS from there, just as if you were standing up your own instance of Linode.
So it's basically envisioning the VM inside of the
Yes. Yep. So each provider has its own set of configuration, and depending on what you want to do, you would follow that particular provider's stack of configurations needed to get it up and running. But the nice thing about it is that you could, so if you're Vagrant or if you're VirtualBox local and your EC2, in production or at higher stages, you literally put them inside that conditional, and when it runs through there, it'll do that one for that and that one for that. And you'll end up with still a consistent environment per the provider. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just make sure I understand. So if you use Linode as your provider on here, is it standing up a virtual machine locally, or is it
Linode. Yep. It'll kick it. It's actually talking out to Linode's API and kicking off.
That's the way.
Yeah. Okay. So, and just so we can save some of those resources, we'll shut this one down. Okay. And that's confirmed powered off. So any questions about the simple? I mean, this is about as simple as it gets. Literally standing up an Apache server, using this, using basic shell scripts. This is what would, and this is actually how I stand up my development environments for my new projects. The only thing, you'll see it actually in the next one, is I enable PHP and Xdebug, and so they're a little bit more complicated shell scripts because they have to do some configuration management of the actual system. So here's a multi-VM, which is going to answer your question. So what we do here is so what we're going to do is we're going to block out chunks for a given box. using the define command. But anything outside the define command is going to be done on every box. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define the box, and I'm going to go back to my faithful Ubuntu. So both of these boxes will be the same base image. And then when that base image comes up, I want to shell in, and I want to do an apt-get update. Now, one thing I do want to bring up is that notice how I'm using apt-get. Well, later versions of Ubuntu use apt. They get rid of the get and the cache and all of that. You don't want to use those because those are actually aliases and not hard-linked applications. If you do some research on it, they'll tell you want to fall back to the most rudimentary command you can for when you're doing these provisioning scripts so that they're consistent across all your operating systems. So even if you did this and you decided to go back to 1204 instead of 1604 or 1404, this command would still work, as opposed to an apt would only be good for, I think, 16 or better or whatever. Then you define a block, and so what I'm saying is I'm naming this computer or VM web, and this is a do block inside of Ruby. I'm defining that everything inside this will be named web. So this is just my instance of this machine. So everything I associate with web inside here is going to only be specifically for this particular box. Is that clear? So it's going to name the host name. It's going to set up port forwarding for Apache. It's going to set a private network to 10.10.10.0.0.10. I don't know if this is going to work here because of the network configuration. And then it's going to do a shell script that's defined for Apache, and we'll show you that here in a minute. And then it's going to pop out of that, and it's going to stand up another box. It's going to name that intro, and then this is going to install MariaDB. It installs Maria. It creates the initial users, the database, and the whole deal. So it's ready to go right when I get started. That's the basic Vagrant file for a multi-machine. So here's the Apache provisioning script, and I got some echo documentation in here, but essentially it's doing apt-get install, and it's installing all my stuff I want for my web server. So it's getting Apache and PHP, your standard PHP modules that you might need, and the MariaDB command line client just for pure convenience. Then we're going to remove the HTML file. We're going to map the Vagrant file to the HTML, soft link it. We're going to enable rewrite on Apache, and then we're going to copy, or we're going to cat oh, this is a here doc. Okay. This is a little bit of a funky thing. Okay. So first off, this is a Ruby here doc that's going into a particular file on the client. Okay. So normally it would just execute it to the command line and execute that. What this is going to do is it's going to cat it out, and it's going to concatenate it to this file. Now there's also a copy feature with Vagrant where you could just take certain files on your host and copy them to your guest, which if you don't need elevated permissions, that's an excellent way to do things.
You already have the configuration files ready to go.
Yeah, the problem is I'm not using those because in order to modify those two files, so you see I do it again down here for the Xdebug, you need elevated permissions. And when it's running the scripts out of your Vagrant file, it is elevated. So you can modify files during the Vagrant file scripts, that you can't do via copy or after you SSH without sudoing or elevating your own permissions. So the one thing you need to keep in mind is, in short, is when you use shell commands inside of a Vagrant file, you're executing them as an elevated user, as root. So any damage you do is permanent, and it will not block you. Okay? So that's why I do them like this, is so that I don't have to worry about elevating my permissions in the meantime. I'm pretty sure somebody's probably come up with a better workaround. But for me, this works just fine. So all I'm doing is I'm enabling that, or turning off that send file in Apache that we talked about earlier, just to make sure there's no conflict. And then here, all I'm doing is enabling Xdebug, because, I mean, who don't need Xdebug if you're doing PHP development, right? If you don't use the Xdebug in PHP development, come and see me afterwards, and we'll get your life straight. And I'll improve your debugging by about 4 times as fast. And then all we do is restart Apache. So that's the Apache script. The MariaDB is pretty simple. Again, you just install MariaDB, and then here we're executing some MySQL commands that grant privileges to the Vagrant user, which is created by default, creates an admin user with a password, grants permissions for it, flushes the privileges, then creates a database, and that's about it for that. Oh, it actually creates a database table as well. Then it updates MariaDB to bind on 000, which exposes it to the outside world. Otherwise, Maria will only allow you to connect from localhost, which is inside your Vagrant, which is pretty much useless unless your Apache is sitting on the same server. And then we restart MySQL. Any questions about those 2 simple scripts?
Are you committing those to version control, or are you using those separately?
I do commit these to version control. There really needs to be a better way to do the password management and stuff. Yeah, and there's ways of setting those inside the Vagrant file as well. But like if you're going to go to an enterprise solution, you really probably should be using Ansible or Puppet or something like that that's a little bit more solid. Something that's a little bit more enterprise friendly and reproducible and got more configuration options. This works fine for me. With this setup, I could start my new project in a VirtualBox in about 10 minutes after it downloads and gets booted and everything, and I have a fresh MariaDB and a fresh Apache box that's ready to go. Okay. Let me demonstrate those for you since let's see. Here's the multi. And as you can see, inside my scripts directory is where those scripts exist. You got anything you want to say before you sneak out, since you weren't heard at the beginning? Okay. See you next month. I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, January. In here, I had a copy of the Xdebug INI that I was going to use copy to come up with, but because of the elevated permissions, it wasn't working. I actually have a DB script and an index.php that gets shared out at runtime from this directory. So if I do a Vagrant up here, you'll see that it'll actually do everything twice. So it can bring up both web and DB. And this is where things get a little bit different in managing your DB, your virtual machines with Vagrant, is because now you have to start naming the machine you want to interact with, or you're going to affect everything. So and certain commands you can't even do You have to name the machine you want to interact with when there's multiples. So you can halt and you can up, and it'll just bring them all up and all down. But if you try to SSH in, you just do Vagrant SSH, it'll go, you got more than one machine, tell me which one you want.
Can you halt one specific
Yes.
machine?
Yep. And you can provision. So like if you get,
Provision specific one.
yeah, you can, so if you modify one block of code that's specific to a particular machine, you can just do Vagrant provision that machine, and it'll do that. Yeah. Now you noticed here it said fixed port collision 22 to 2222. So what happened was that the web box came up first. It grabbed that default port. So now the second machine come up, it's automatically resolving the conflict for you. And now I have these up. So if I do Vagrant status, you'll see I have multiple boxes listed. So now I have web and DB updated. If I wanted to Vagrant SSH into one of them, it's going to freak out and tell me I need to tell it a name, do web, and now it dumps me right in, and it says I need to update it. It's been a while since I ran it. So, and then you just exit back out, and I'm right where I began. Let's see. Uh, 8887. So here's my basic PHP file. I just dumped a PHP info. Then if I do /db.php, which is the other file in there, I drop into, I have no clue. Apparently this was something I was developing on that test form. Oh, I think this lets me create a user. So it's just a way to interact with the database. So questions regarding that? Okay. So I'm going to pull up. So what you'll find is that Vagrant's pretty mature. I think it's, if I'm not mistaken. What is it? I'm going to do. Oh, it's actually only on 1.9, but it's been around a long time. There's a lot of integrations, your Sublime, your JetBrains ecosystem, all of it, Komodo, Eclipse, they all have integrations directly with Vagrant to where you don't even have to drop out of your IDE to manage them. So I'm going to open up PHP Storm here, and I'm inside of my production stuff. And if you go down here to Vagrant, you'll see that I have all these nice features. The only one that's lacking in the JetBrains stack is status. So for some reason, I have to drop to the command line to check my status. If you do an up on an already running VM, it doesn't do anything. It just says I'm up and running. So there's not really a good reason to have necessarily status, except for just curiosity, I guess. So
How does it know here which VM you're trying to target?
well, it's so normally your Vagrant file would exist in your project directory, but in this case, I had to go into preferences and then Vagrant, and in this case, current project. Yeah, I had to tell it where my Vagrant file was. But by default, this would be the same location as your code base. Yeah. Mine didn't work because it was in a different location. The DevOps guys like to maintain his Vagrant environments in a separate code base. So we always have to manage my code base plus the Vagrant code base, and I have to update them independently. If you're going to be consistent about it, you just put it in the base of your folder and be done with it.
Most people use it with the intention that you can check out the project from whatever revision control type in Vagrant up, and it doesn't really use you, so you have
Yeah, so like you would have your packages.js or your composer whatever it is. The PHP version. Yeah, composer JSON. All that stuff just lives at the base of your NPM. So you would just essentially do your Vagrant up, your NPM install, your composer install, all that, and you would have a running environment. So most of your IDEs have integrations. I've sort of been demonstrating this the whole time. You can interact with these. If for some reason everything just goes south inside a VirtualBox, you can just hit show. And what it did was it just popped open this would be the equivalent of a monitor into that box. Now I can log in and I can start messing with that box directly. Again, if you do a reboot at this location, all those port mappings and stuff that are defined in your Vagrant file, they disappear. So in order to get those, you literally have to manage it through Vagrant. And if I close this right now, it'll kill the box. So, and then, let's see. If you watch, we'll do a Vagrant halt, and this will go away. And it started it up web and DB, and now you'll see it's going to shut it down in reverse, just for a curiosity thing. So if one's dependent on the other, it'll just bring them. It'll do it in the order that they're defined in the Vagrant file. So as you can see, that display went away. Just keep in mind that any modifications you do in here directly in your provider are going to be lost upon the next interaction with Vagrant, bringing it up or down or reprovisioning it. So the next steps, you could do, you could get into the advanced provisioning, Ansible, Salt, Chef. I got it in there that time. You could start using the cloud or the SaaS, Amazon, Linode, Google. Create your own base box. So what you can do is after you get so like if I continuously use Ubuntu and I start installing Apache very consistently, I can create my own base box. And that way I don't have to do those provisioning steps every single time. So then I start using that base box instead of my Ubuntu base box. Essentially, that's what Laravel Homestead has done. They created their own base box, and if you want to start there, then that's where you use that base box instead of the Ubuntu box. Because it comes with Redis and all kinds, Opcache, and yeah, PHP, and I think he uses Nginx, and all that stuff's configured, ready to go. So, and then if you are so inclined, you can actually distribute your base box back up to the repository under your namespace. They use your username and then the name of your box, so you could share it with the world if you're so inclined.
What's the 30-second version of how you create your own base box?
It's sort of a pain. The command isn't hard. It literally exports an entire VM.
Okay, so you have your VM that you want it, and then you just tell it to use the base box.
Yeah, you literally copy. Repackage. That will create a base box for you.
You just give it a name, I guess.
Yeah, you give it a set of whatever you want to name it, and then that puts it in your local repository, and then you publish it somewhere in here. There's a publish command.
So at that point, you've essentially forked it, and any updates that come in from your base box and you base it off of, you're
Correct. So now you're maintaining the box. If you go and do a search on Vagrant Up, they actually recommend that you don't, because it's time consuming. It's literally like maintaining your own machine and verifying security's all up to date. Your packages are all up to date. It's literally,
going to spend a lot more time doing that than just
yeah. Yep. That's why it's nice to get your provisioning scripts settled, because then you get the fresh OS, you get the fresh VM every time, and then you just install. And actually with the apt update and the Apache installs, straight out, you're always getting whatever the OS says is the current instance of that software as well, unless you start providing version numbers for that as well. So that's pretty much all I got. Is there any additional questions? It's not terribly difficult to get up and running with Vagrant. There's just a few of those gotchas like the send file and, don't run destroy if you don't really want to. I did that the first time I was using Docker because for some reason their destroy command, it isn't destroy. So I don't remember. At least it wasn't whenever I tried it. So, yeah. Yep. Yep. And then just for Brian, me and Brian have been having a conversation about Docker versus Vagrant for about 3 months now, I guess. We've been all talking about these two talks that have been coming up, and we just sort of been bouncing ideas off of each other. And so it says WordPress, but it's really some concepts about Vagrant versus Docker and how a simple WordPress site differs in the two, kind of gives you an idea. And then how Docker is different than a normal VM. I know this is a VM talk, but it's just the ecosystem that we live in right now. And then the HashiCorp ecosystem, like I said, they've got everything from your basic open source Vagrant all the way up to server managed kind of stuff. So
your point about the second link, I mean, like you said, it's just kind of where we are. But that, to me, Timmy gave the Spark talk last week. I was talking to him last night. He was talking about using Docker as his VM. He kept just disparaging Vagrant. I'm just like, well, I asked him to come tonight, but you shouldn't really use Docker as a VM. You can use it as like a poor man's VM, but really there is a different use case. Exactly right. So I was trying to explain that to him, but I didn't know Vagrant at all. So
yeah.
I'm actually going to point him to these slides so you can take a look at that.
Yeah, my impression of Docker is it should either be a very significantly small application or a single process.
Yeah, exactly.
And I really haven't seen anybody justify a bigger use of it than that.
And there's just a fundamental difference between, like they talk about with Docker, with containers versus VMs. With VMs or even bare metal, that's remediation. You actually go out to this server or this image or whatever and make changes. Whereas that's remediation. With containers, it's recreation. You usually don't want to jump into a container and update it. You just wipe it out and just install a new one. So
containers are very, very volatile.
Right.
Is what I understand.
Yeah.
Well, the reason why you use containers is you want like horizontal scalability.
Right, faster.
Yeah. Well, and once you get into EC2s, you can do that with this too. But I mean, I'm not sure how simple that would be at that point, though. So.
The first link, did you give me a ego example?
No, you're going to have to go read it. It was about 2 months ago I found it and started on this slide deck. The URL to it's right there, and it'll be up. I'll post it in the notes after in Meetup. So, and this is a live link, so you can just come to this slide and head on over there. So as far as feedback, here's how to get a hold of me. My website, slides, the code, the two Vagrant file setups and the scripts and all that are published on GitHub. If you want to go grab them and steal them and modify them for your own use, have at it. I will accept a pull request. If you find I did something wrong, I'm okay with that. Our Meetup, if you got here some other way than through Meetup, here's our Meetup. You can check us out for the future. If you're not a member of STL Tech Slack team, it's a Slack team that has hundreds of St. Louis area developers and even some that have been here and moved away, I noticed recently. It's a valuable resource. There's a certain individual at the other end of the table that's very active in the hardware channel. And we have a channel on there that's STL Full Stack Web Dev that's just, I mean, if you have a question about tonight or something in general and you want to address this group specifically, feel free to jump in there and ask a question. We do the best we can. It's a smaller subset of the whole Slack team, so I don't know that our expertise is as vast as the whole thing, but yeah. If you're a little leery to ask the group as an entirety, jump in there. There's never been a stupid question asked. The only stupid question ever asked is the one that didn't get asked.
And in general, Civil Tech is like, it's a Slack group, so it's a big group chat application. It's turning into kind of a local dev